I had barely taken my seat at the dinner table when I realized the tension in the room wasn't going to be subtle. My dad's eyes scanned me like I was some unwelcome intruder, and before I could even think of greeting him properly, he barked across the table, "You and your kid are just freeloaders." The words hit me like a fist, and for a moment, I froze, my fork trembling in my hand. My child looked up at me with wide eyes, hurt and confused, and I felt a pang of shame mixed with rage. Mom didn't say a word, her gaze fixed somewhere above the table as if she were giving silent approval. I wanted to scream, to defend us, but the words caught in my throat. Every laugh, every toast from the rest of the family felt like it was at my expense. My heart pounded as humiliation wrapped around me, a heavy cloak I couldn't shrug off. I wanted to vanish, to escape, but leaving would only prove their point. My child's small hand found mine under the table, a lifeline in the storm, and I gritted my teeth, vowing silently that this night wouldn't define us. The heat in my cheeks burned, a mixture of anger and embarrassment, and I realized, as my dad leaned back smugly in his chair, that this wasn't just a single insult. It was a declaration, a signal that nothing I had done would ever earn their respect. Every glance from my siblings felt like judgment, and even my cousins, who had always seemed harmless, wore faint smirks that cut deeper than knives. I swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of nausea and fury, knowing that this family dinner, meant to be ordinary and warm, had become the stage for my most public humiliation. I wanted to tell them off, to shatter their smug little world, but I kept my voice low, my mind racing with plans and what-ifs. That night, as I helped my child with their uneaten food, I realized that whatever came next, whatever fight I chose or strategy I plotted, it had to be smart, precise, and inevitable. I couldn't let anger blind me, but I couldn't let this moment pass without meaning. The tension hung in the air like a storm about to break, and I clenched my fists under the table, promising myself that one day they would regret this night as deeply as I would remember it. I remember sitting in my childhood bedroom, staring at the faded wallpaper and thinking about all the times I had tried to earn their approval, only to be overlooked. I was always the quiet one, the helper, the one who picked up after my siblings, who stayed late to babysit cousins while my parents praised everyone else. I missed birthdays and weekends, working to keep the household running, yet it never seemed to matter. My achievements were brushed aside. Good grades, awards, even my first scholarship, while my older siblings' smallest victories were celebrated with fanfare and gifts. I sacrificed so much, giving them everything I had, believing love and recognition would follow. But the truth was stark. Favoritism ran deep, and I was invisible. I remember one Christmas when I had saved for months to buy a meaningful gift for my mom. She barely glanced at it before praising my sister for her flashy present. The sting of that day never left me, and betrayals weren't just emotional, they were public. At school events, family gatherings, even casual conversations, I was diminished, dismissed, or forgotten, and I watched as others were elevated. Each moment added to the weight of resentment building inside me, a slow, simmering fire I barely acknowledged at the time. Yet, in the quiet of my room, I kept a private journal filled with hopes and dreams, tiny rebellions in ink, imagining a life where my efforts were recognized, my voice heard. The contrast between what I gave and what I received was stark, almost cruel. Every thank you I didn't get, every glance that passed me by etched a silent question into my mind. Why did I care so much for people who never truly cared for me? That memory, vivid and painful, resurfaced now at the dinner table, fueling a quiet rage. The realization hit me harder than Dad's words ever could. This pattern wasn't new. It had been decades in the making. And now, with my child watching, the stakes were higher than ever. I would not allow history to repeat itself. This wasn't just about humiliation at dinner. It was about reclaiming every stolen moment, every dismissed effort, every shred of dignity I had ever lost. The fire inside me ignited fully, and I felt the first trembling surge of resolve. The moment I closed the door behind us, the tension from the dinner table seemed to crash into me all at once. I sank onto the couch, my child curling next to me, their small hand finding mine as if offering a silent apology for the things they didn't understand. "Why did he say that, Mom?" they whispered, their voice trembling. I swallowed hard, forcing a calm I didn't feel. Because sometimes people forget what's important, I murmured, unsure if it sounded convincing even to myself. My mind raced over every insult, every dismissive look, every unspoken judgment from my parents. The shame still burned, but beneath it, anger started to rise, a slow, steady heat that threatened to consume the helplessness. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made for a family that never saw me, all the times I put their needs before my own, only to be discarded like a stranger. And yet, sitting here with my child, I realized something essential. This moment didn't have to define us. I whispered to them, "We're stronger than they think, and we'll show them one day." My voice, though soft, carried conviction I hadn't felt in years. I pictured the life I wanted, free from ridicule and contempt, and a plan began to take shape. Every humiliating word from Dad, every silent nod from Mom, became fuel, proof of why I couldn't back down. The quiet of the house wrapped around us, and I allowed myself to finally breathe, knowing that anger alone wasn't enough. I needed patience, strategy, and unwavering determination. In that stillness, I promised myself I would rise, and when the time came, I would make sure they remembered exactly who we were and what they had underestimated. The humiliation was sharp, but now, it was also the spark of something powerful, something I was ready to turn into action. That night, I lay awake drafting lists in my head like a general mapping territory. The humiliation at the table replayed, but somewhere under the burn of shame there was a cold, clear voice that kept repeating, "Not again." I couldn't undo what my father said, but I could decide what came after. I promised myself, out loud in the dark, that my child and I would never be pawns in their story again. Ideas came in fits and starts. First, I needed money that wasn't tied to them, a steady, reliable safety net. Second, I needed people who saw me for me, not as an extension of their family drama. Third, I needed proof, paper trails, receipts, anything that could expose hypocrisy if the moment called for it. I scribbled mental notes, update resume, reach out to former colleagues, set aside a small emergency fund, close the accounts that bore their names, document every interaction that felt like manipulation. When my child stirred and asked if I was mad, I pulled them close and tried to explain without poisoning their view of family. "I'm upset, but we're okay," I said. "We're going to make things better." Their trust felt fragile and precious. I did not want my plans to be built on their confusion, so secrecy was part strategy, part mercy. I would protect them from the ugliness while teaching them resilience through example. I started small the next day. I blocked my father's number, not out of pettiness, but to stop the reflex of answering every call that might derail my focus. I opened a savings account in my name alone and set up automatic transfers, tiny amounts that multiplied like seeds. I updated my LinkedIn and messaged 2 former managers I respected, keeping the tone light while hinting at availability. The practical steps soothed my outrage and turned abstract anger into forward momentum. At the same time, I began documenting old messages, the inheritance conversation I'd overheard years ago, the way Mom always dismissed my accomplishments, everything I could use to build a narrative if needed. I photographed receipts, recorded dates, wrote summaries in a private file labeled simply, "When the time comes." It felt vindictive to prepare evidence even as I promised myself I wouldn't be consumed by revenge. But I also knew that power demanded preparation. If they wanted to play with reputations, I would be ready with facts. I also reached out to a cousin who had quietly shown me kindness over the years. We met for coffee under the pretense of catching up, but I tested the waters, listening for any hint of alliance. Small allies matter. They shift the geometry of power. My cousin offered practical support, a lead on a freelance opportunity, a referral to a childcare co-op. Little things that, stitched together, could unmake the fragile safety net my parents assumed they controlled. At the heart of every plan was a promise: protect my child's innocence while building a life that made my father's words irrelevant. My strategy wasn't about dramatic payback. It was about reclaiming daily dignity and independence. Still, the possibility of a public reckoning simmered in the background, a final act saved for a time when consequences would be undeniable. For now, I moved like a quiet storm, organized, patient, and unstoppable. I felt ready to start rebuilding the simpler, stubborn parts of my life: skills, savings, solitude, that would become the foundation of the future I intended, and I would prevail. The following weeks became a blur of effort, small victories, and quiet setbacks. I threw myself into work like it was a lifeline, picking up extra projects and volunteering for assignments I would have shied away from before. Each completed task, each acknowledgement from colleagues, felt like a small, private triumph. Proof that I could be competent and valued without needing approval from home. I set up a strict budget, tracking every dollar, feeling a growing sense of control with each deposit into my new savings account. Watching the balance grow, no matter how slowly, was oddly empowering. It was tangible proof that I was reclaiming autonomy. Not everything went smoothly. A project fell through, and I had to swallow disappointment, reminding myself that progress wasn't linear. Some old habits surfaced, self-doubt, guilt for spending money on myself, but I countered them with deliberate action. Networking lunches, online courses, and reconnecting with friends who treated me like a human being rather than an invisible family accessory. Socially, I found a small circle of allies. One colleague, impressed by my focus, offered advice on career advancement. A former neighbor invited me to a community group where I felt welcomed for the first time in years. These interactions, small as they seemed, began reshaping my worldview. I wasn't alone, and support existed beyond the toxic family dynamics I'd always relied on. I noticed subtle changes in myself. I walked taller, spoke with more confidence, and laughed more freely with my child, who mirrored my cautious optimism. Even mundane victories, like negotiating a better deal on a freelance contract or getting a compliment on my work, felt revolutionary after years of being overlooked. Every step reinforced the idea that independence wasn't just possible, it was imminent. Yet beneath the small wins, a quiet fire persisted. I began jotting ideas for long-term plans, ways to assert control without sacrificing the child's safety. The humiliation at dinner still echoed, but now it fueled determination instead of despair. I realized that transformation wasn't only about money or social proof. It was about reclaiming a sense of identity and dignity that had been denied for decades. Slowly, steadily, I was building a version of myself my family hadn't anticipated. Capable, self-reliant, and quietly unstoppable. Weeks of quiet effort suddenly paid off in a way I hadn't dared hope for. A client I'd been working tirelessly for called me personally, praising my initiative and offering a permanent promotion that came with more responsibility and a significant raise. I felt a rush of disbelief and triumph, a validation that had nothing to do with my family's approval. For the first time in years, my hard work directly translated into power and independence, and I reveled in the private victory. At home, life appeared unchanged to anyone looking in. Dad still scowled during calls, Mom remained distant, and family gatherings hadn't yet occurred to showcase my growth. But beneath their obliviousness, I was quietly reclaiming authority over my life. I updated my resume, organized finances, and carefully planned next steps, all while maintaining a calm exterior around my child, who noticed my subtle changes. Confidence in my voice, a lighter step, and laughter that felt less forced. Even my social circles started to reflect this shift. Friends commented on my poise, colleagues sought my input, and opportunities began to multiply. Each small acknowledgement was a reinforcement of my growing self-worth, proof that I could thrive independently. The humiliation from that family dinner felt increasingly distant, replaced by a sense of strategic patience and anticipation. I savored this hidden ascent, knowing that my family remained blind to the transformation. The power reversal wasn't loud or explosive yet, but it was real and undeniable. And deep down, I knew that when the moment came to confront the past, the contrast between who I had been and who I was becoming would hit them harder than any words I could say. For now, the stage was mine to set, and I had already begun writing the opening act of my quiet triumph. The next family gathering was uneventful on the surface, but beneath the smiles and small talk, I tested the waters of my newfound confidence. Dad made his usual jabs, casual insults thinly veiled as jokes, but this time I didn't flinch. Instead, I answered with calm, measured words, each one deliberate, carrying an undercurrent of quiet authority that made him pause more than once. Mom's eyes flickered with skepticism, as if she couldn't decide whether to scold me or be impressed. And that hesitation gave me a subtle edge. I dropped small hints of my successes, mentioning new responsibilities at work or projects I was spearheading, carefully avoiding arrogance yet making it impossible for them to ignore. Dad waved them off, muttering that I was lucky or overestimating myself, but his voice lacked the certainty it once held. Mom's silence was more telling than words. I could see her mind racing, realizing that the child she had once dismissed was now watching me navigate these encounters with poise and strength. Even minor moments, like refusing to accept a critical comment without explanation, became small victories. I noticed the way my child's eyes followed me, admiration and trust reflected in their gaze, reinforcing my sense that we were no longer powerless. Each exchange, no matter how brief, built tension. A slow burn that suggested something was shifting beneath the family's familiar hierarchy. I wasn't just present anymore. I was asserting a subtle authority, a presence they hadn't anticipated. By the end of the evening, the air felt charged, unspoken challenges hanging between us. Dad's dismissals no longer landed as intended, and Mom's uncertainty was palpable. I left the gathering with a sense of satisfaction tempered by anticipation. These subtle confrontations were the groundwork for a larger reckoning, and I could feel the balance beginning to tip in our favor. A week later, a chance conversation with an extended relative revealed something I hadn't expected. A long-hidden family secret that explained so much of the favoritism and subtle cruelty I had endured. Apparently, Dad had been diverting portions of the inheritance and family assets toward my older sibling for years, leaving me and my child with nothing, while publicly pretending to treat us fairly. The revelation hit me like a thunderclap, a mix of shock, anger, and vindication. Every insult, every dismissal, every slight at family gatherings suddenly had context. It wasn't personal failings on my part. It was deliberate manipulation. I spent the evening processing the information, retracing memories that now felt sinisterly orchestrated. The unacknowledged college fund, the skipped birthdays, the unavailable financial support that was easily accessible for others. Each memory became a piece of evidence, a building block for the strategy forming in my mind. My child noticed my quiet intensity and asked if I was upset. I held them close, assuring them we were okay, even as my mind raced with possibilities. The injustice fueled a new sense of determination. I realized the secret could serve as leverage, not just to claim what was rightfully ours, but to expose the hypocrisy and entitlement of those who had taken me for granted. I began drafting careful plans, weighing risks, documenting details, and imagining the timing of a public revelation that would leave no room for denial. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was my resolve. By the end of the night, a clear picture had emerged. I wouldn't just rebuild quietly. I would ensure the truth came to light, that the consequences of their favoritism and mismanagement would be undeniable. The humiliation and disregard of my past became fuel for a strategy grounded in patience, intelligence, and inevitability. I could feel the tension in my chest, equal parts excitement and righteous anger, knowing the moment of reckoning was being meticulously prepared. I moved with the quiet precision of someone who had finally learned to think 3 steps ahead. The family secret was a blade. I would not brandish it recklessly. Instead, I built a web of support and proof that would make denial impossible. First, I consulted a lawyer who specialized in estate disputes. I didn't announce it to anyone. Appointments were scheduled on my lunch breaks. Documents were filed under a barely used email address, and conversations were kept brief and factual. The lawyer confirmed that there were irregularities worth pursuing and taught me how to gather evidence without tipping anyone off. At the same time, I cultivated social proof. I accepted a speaking invitation at a local community forum about financial empowerment for single parents. The talk was genuine, about budgeting, self-worth, and reclaiming stability, but it also positioned me as someone respected and capable in public. Word spread, and a journalist from a neighborhood paper reached out for a profile about my work and my path to independence. I never mentioned family drama, but the profile highlighted my competence and the real, measurable steps I'd taken to build a life on my own. Allies mattered. My cousin, who had quietly sympathized for years, became an active ally, helping me access old family documents that were easier to find than I'd expected. She lent her stability and corroborated memories that filled gaps in my records. A former manager provided a character reference that, when combined with the paper trail, strengthened my credibility in both legal and social arenas. Even small allies, a supportive teacher at my child's school, a neighbor who witnessed certain events, were invaluable when they agreed to provide statements if needed. I also used financial savvy as a tool. I consolidated accounts, moved savings into protected accounts, and set up transparent contracts for freelance work that could be shown as proof of legitimate income. The idea was to create a public record of stability and independence that contradicted their portrayal of me as a freeloader. If the fight moved to court or to public discourse, I wanted every dollar and every email to speak for me. Technology became my quiet accomplice. I digitized old receipts, scanned letters, and arranged dates on a timeline that made sense to anyone who might read it. I saved voice messages, screenshots, and even a few careless admissions from relatives who had left incriminating comments in group chats. Each piece was innocuous on its own, but together they formed an undeniable pattern. There was also strategy and pacing. I staged small reveals through trusted channels. A tip to an investigative reporter about estate mismanagement phrased as a concern for fairness. A casual mention in a community meeting that hinted at irregularities. A legal notice served to a family attorney that signaled seriousness without theatrics. These moves were not about humiliation. They were about insisting on accountability. Through it all, I kept my child sheltered from the mechanics of the plan. They saw only the brighter parts. My new job responsibilities, a weekend trip that felt like freedom, laughter that was no longer forced. My child's safety and emotional well-being were non-negotiable, so every public step was measured against what it would do to them. By the time the first official demand letter went out, I had assembled a file that matched the story in my head: evidence, allies, public credibility, and a clear legal claim. I wasn't acting out of petty revenge. I was insisting on fairness and truth. I rehearsed responses and anticipated denials, but I also rehearsed mercy, prepared to accept apologies if they were sincere. Still, I knew one thing with brutal clarity. When the truth surfaced, nothing would feel the same again. The reckoning I'd arranged was not cruelty, it was balance, finally restored. And I was ready to watch the truth unfold today too. The day finally came when all the careful planning, quiet victories, and painstaking documentation led to a single, inevitable moment. It wasn't a grand spectacle at first, just a family gathering under the guise of normalcy. I arrived with my child at my side, calm, composed, and aware that the balance of power had shifted entirely. Dad, as usual, launched into his usual insults, calling me lazy, accusing me of being ungrateful, and smirking at the supposed incompetence that had always defined me in his eyes. But this time I didn't flinch. I let him speak, letting his words hang in the air like smoke before I began to dismantle them. One by one, fact by fact, I presented evidence of the inheritance mismanagement. Bank statements, emails, documents that proved what he had redirected, and the favoritism that had shaped decades of our lives. Each piece was carefully laid out, not as a tantrum, but as undeniable truth. Dad's smug expression faltered with every revelation, the certainty in his voice crumbling as my words sank in. I could see the panic flashing in his eyes, the first crack in the facade of dominance he had built for so long. Mom's silence, which had always been a weapon against me, finally wavered. I addressed her directly, asking pointed questions about why she had allowed favoritism to guide her actions, and why she had stood by while I and my child were demeaned. Her hesitancy was palpable, the room shifting with tension as she realized that silence no longer protected her. Through it all, my child watched with wide eyes, absorbing the transformation I had undergone. I was no longer the timid, overlooked figure who had cowered at Dad's words. I was strong, composed, and unafraid, and they understood that strength was ours together. Their grip on my hand tightened slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of pride and trust that made my chest swell. Every insult from Dad now landed empty. Every smirk from the rest of the family dissolved against the evidence and the calm authority I radiated. I didn't shout or rage. Instead, I let the truth do the work. I spoke calmly about fairness, respect, and accountability, highlighting patterns that no one could deny. The room became electric with unspoken shock, a collective gasp filling the space as relatives processed the extent of the deception and hypocrisy. Dad tried to deflect, to turn accusations into complaints about my attitude, but it was too late. Mom tried to intervene, but the moment demanded honesty over convenience. I refused to let excuses cloud the facts. Every counter-argument was met with clarity and documentation. When the confrontation ended, the room was quiet. Dad's arrogance was shattered, replaced with a tentative, almost fearful uncertainty. Mom, confronted with her own choices and complicity, no longer had the comfort of passive observation. My child, eyes shining, looked up at me as if seeing me for the first time, not just as a parent, but as a person capable of strength and decisive action. I realized that the humiliation from years past had transformed into something entirely different: empowerment, justice, and a public reckoning that was both necessary and healing. Walking out of that room, I felt a weight lift, a tension break that I hadn't known was tethering me for decades. The catharsis wasn't just mine. It belonged to my child, to every unseen sacrifice, to every silent tear I had shed. For the first time, our family dynamic had shifted irreversibly. I was no longer invisible, no longer powerless. And in that stillness after confrontation, I finally tasted the sweet, unshakable satisfaction of vindication. In the hours and days that followed, the family's reactions were a mix of stunned silence, whispered conversations, and visible regret. Dad avoided my gaze, his usual confidence replaced with an awkward tension that made every interaction uncomfortable. Mom, who had long relied on silence as her shield, now seemed hesitant and uncertain, unsure how to reconcile her past choices with the truth that had been laid bare. Siblings who had once mimicked his approval now looked at me with something closer to respect, or maybe wariness, realizing that the person they had dismissed for years had quietly built a life far beyond their assumptions. I spent much of that time reflecting on what had happened, not just the confrontation itself, but the months of preparation that led to it. I thought about my child, who had witnessed me standing firm and commanding authority without anger or malice, and I felt a surge of pride and relief. This wasn't just about exposing hypocrisy. It was about modeling strength, resilience, and strategic thinking. I had learned to channel pain into action, to transform humiliation into clarity, and to navigate challenges without losing sight of what mattered most: dignity and protection of the ones I love. There were moments of quiet satisfaction, too, reminders that the patience, planning, and small victories had compounded into something tangible. I revisited old memories of being overlooked, ignored, or dismissed, and now I could see them through a different lens. Each slight had shaped me into someone capable of persistence, empathy, and foresight. The emotional scars remained, but they were no longer wounds. They were markers of growth and strength. Some family members reached out hesitantly, expressing remorse or tentative attempts at reconciliation. I received these gestures with measured openness, aware that true change required accountability and reflection, not just words. I felt a calm certainty in myself that had been absent for decades, a sense of stability and inner authority. My child continued to mirror my resilience, thriving in the security of a parent who no longer bent under others' judgment. Ultimately, the aftermath taught me more than any confrontation could. I learned that empowerment is cultivated through action, patience, and strategy, that respect is earned, not demanded, and that even in the most toxic of environments, growth is possible when determination outweighs fear. By embracing these lessons, I could face the future with confidence, knowing that the humiliation of the past had been transformed into strength, and that we, my child and I, had finally reclaimed our rightful place in the world. Months later, the transformation felt complete. I was fully independent, financially secure, and emotionally resilient in ways I had never imagined. My child thrived alongside me, buoyed by the stability and confidence I now exuded. Mornings were filled with laughter, homework, and quiet routines we had built together. Small victories that felt monumental after years of turmoil. I no longer measured myself against the expectations or whims of my parents. My worth was self-defined, and my child's trust reinforced it every day. The family had adjusted, some with regret, some with continued resistance. But the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Dad avoided passive-aggressive digs, and Mom's silence no longer carried the weight of control. It was replaced by tentative acknowledgement that she could no longer manipulate our narrative. Siblings and relatives treated me differently, subtly at first, then with overt respect, recognizing the person I had become. I allowed myself to feel pride, tempered with compassion. I didn't revel in their discomfort, but I accepted the justice that had quietly settled in its place. There was a bittersweet quality to the victory. I mourned the years lost to neglect, the opportunities I had sacrificed, and the childlike yearning for validation that would never return. Yet those losses had shaped me, carving resilience and wisdom where naivety once lived. I reflected on the journey, the humiliation, the meticulous planning, the strategic maneuvers, and realized that every setback had been a necessary step toward this equilibrium. In this full-circle moment, I understood the depth of our achievement. Justice had been served, not through rage or spectacle, but through clarity, preparation, and unshakable integrity. My child saw firsthand that strength and dignity were not gifts, but cultivated traits, and that standing firm in truth could transform a lifetime of injustice. As we sat together in our home, sharing a quiet evening that belonged only to us, I allowed myself a final, deep exhale. The past would always echo, but it no longer controlled us. We had reclaimed our story, our lives, and our peace, and in that reclamation lay the sweetest form of revenge, empowerment, closure, and the enduring knowledge that we had triumphed on our own terms. Just when I thought the story had reached its natural end, life delivered a subtle, almost poetic twist. Dad, emboldened by overconfidence, made a careless decision. He publicly invested in a project without properly vetting it, and within weeks, it collapsed spectacularly. Friends and colleagues whispered about the failed venture, and the very same people who had once admired him now questioned his judgment. The humiliation was quiet but undeniable, a reflection of the arrogance that had fueled his years of condescension toward me. Mom, who had long remained a passive observer, faced her own reckoning. A distant relative discovered her role in mismanaging the family trust and insisted on legal oversight, forcing her to answer for her complicity. Their status and comfort, built on favoritism and deceit, crumbled in small, precise ways that didn't require confrontation from me. I didn't orchestrate this. I simply watched as karma unfolded naturally, affirming that their actions had consequences far beyond my intervention. Witnessing this, my child smiled knowingly. Recognizing that justice wasn't always loud or dramatic, I felt a quiet satisfaction ripple through me. Not gloating, but a serene acknowledgement that the scales had finally balanced. My careful planning had ensured our safety and empowerment, and now the universe itself seemed to deliver its own reckoning. The final twist left me reflective, proud, and reassured. Even when vindication comes quietly, the lessons and consequences of arrogance and cruelty are never lost. A year later, our lives had settled into a rhythm that felt both earned and effortless. I woke each morning with purpose, managing a career that challenged and fulfilled me, while my child thrived in school and blossomed socially. The laughter in our home no longer carried tension or fear. It was light, authentic, and shared freely. Friends and colleagues sought my advice, valuing my insight and calm authority, a reflection of the confidence I had painstakingly cultivated. Family interactions had shifted entirely. I no longer approached gatherings with dread or fear of judgment. When I chose to attend, it was on my terms, with boundaries firmly in place and the power dynamic unmistakably altered. My parents' and siblings' behavior had changed too. Respect, sometimes grudging, was now the default. I realized that their recognition no longer defined me, but it was satisfying to see them adjust to a reality where I could not be dismissed. Financial independence, emotional stability, and strategic foresight had become our foundation. We traveled, pursued opportunities, and celebrated milestones without the shadow of past humiliation. My child observed not just a parent who had survived adversity, but one who had transformed challenges into triumph, teaching resilience, patience, and dignity through example. In these quiet, victorious moments, I reflected on the journey, the humiliation, the planning, the confrontations, and the ultimate empowerment. Every struggle had shaped us. Every setback had been a lesson, and every triumph felt richly deserved. We had reclaimed our narrative, our dignity, and our peace, and in that reclamation, I felt a deep, unshakable satisfaction, not revenge for its own sake, but proof that perseverance, intelligence, and unwavering self-respect could turn even the darkest chapters into a story of triumph and hope.